Good evening. This is the IPR Game Room, and tonight we'll be looking at Chivalry and Sorcery, 5th edition. Now, if you're anything like me, and if you're watching this, you probably are, you love a big, thick fantasy role-playing game book, and at 600 pages, Chivalry and Sorcery, 5th edition is very big and thick and contains an awful lot of information. Now, apparently, I'd never heard of this game before, and I got my first role-playing game book when I was 8 in 1978. And apparently this game's been in continual publication in various forms and editions since 1977. So it has a fairly storied history as a British role-playing game that I was simply not aware of. Now, the basic concept of the game is that it is a simulation of kind of an alternate 12th century France medieval setting with a lot of crunch to it. It has its own interesting game mechanics that are not actually a clone of Dungeons and Dragons. It's actually quite different, but I'll get back to that in a minute. I'm obviously not a professional historian. I'm a professional, book and game seller. But I read a lot of history, so I'm an amateur historian, and I admire historians. There's a lot of work that goes into the profession of being a real historian. A lot of education, a lot of time, decades of learning. But I've read a fair amount of medieval history, and maybe you have as well. And a lot was going on in the world in the 12th century. This is what we typically call high medieval, when medieval society was reaching a real high watermark before the Black Plague came in and just destroyed everything. And analogous to this going on in China was the Song Dynasty, which was a very, very cultural high watermark right before the Mongolians came in and pretty much crushed everything and ended that and set up their own dynasty. But in the case of the Song Dynasty, you begin to see a lot of elements of things that lead into what we think of as modern civilization, medically, scientifically, gunpowder, chemistry, watches, printing presses. Like, it was really going on in the Song Dynasty. And kind of the same thing was happening in France in the 12th century. Not as advanced in those areas, but a very high state of culture. A very developed, structured, in many ways we would consider to be kind of an oppressive culture, but actually like a real flowering of the arts, metallurgy, politics, and a lot of other things happened in the 12th century in France. Again, just in time for the Black Plague to come along and ruin all of that. So the basic idea of this game is it takes place in that time frame. And there's a lot of information in there about the high medieval period. Now, it has some options for playing other phases of the medieval period. And of course, there are a wide selection of world building rules in it, because it doesn't really give you, like, it doesn't have like a map of France and Germany and the Low Countries and northern Italy and northern Spain and southern England or anything like that. It doesn't say, okay, well, here's where the Duke of so-and-so is, and here's where the Count of this and that is, and here's what's going on in Lyon and stuff like that. It's more very general information about what medieval society was like in great detail. But really, it encourages you with its system building to start really small. To start with a very small area. It gives you complete rules for setting up sort of a barony, a feudal system with a few layers, and then having your characters move within that small region as you build outwards. But the default setting is that kind of high medieval pre-Black Plague French period. And interestingly, it has all sorts of, it has a bestiary in it with all sorts of monsters. It has all sorts of rules for playing elves and dwarves and humanoids. So you can take that basic idea of sort of high medieval France and say, okay, well, in the Pyrenees Mountains, there's a kingdom of dwarves, and you roll with that. Or, in the Black Forest, a lot of elves, the Elven Kingdom. It lets you put that in if you want. It's there and available. It also has a great deal of information, not only about medieval Christianity, but about medieval Judaism and Islam, and also the various remnant pagan traditions, which we would typically kind of call witchcraft. It's all in there. I found it really very interesting and very complete, very completist, if you will. I was also impressed by its fairly complete magic system, but I'll go into that a little more when I get into the rules. But again, if you're looking for a storied, highly developed fantasy role-playing game that's really not Dungeons and Dragons, it really has a very different concept it runs off of, then you might want to really investigate Chivalry and Sorcery. It really it has the feel, when you look at something like these days at a Call of Cthulhu book, or any of the various Hero Games books, or anything like Rollmaster, anything that's really been in development for 40 years, it has that kind of feel to it. You can tell a lot of people have worked on this game over the years, a lot of development, a lot of time and energy. The game system that Chivalry and Sorcery uses is called Skillshape. And it's a really, it's a very interesting way of running a role-playing game. It's kind of old school, but it has kind of a lot of modern elements in it. So it's a percentile-based system of 2 D10s plus an additional D10 that represents either critical hit or critical miss. So you roll 3 D10 at once. 2 are percentile dice that determine whether you are successful in an action or not, depending on a wide variety of factors, including what skills you have, what a relevant characteristic is, how difficult it is, whether there's someone or something else resisting you doing it. And then when you determine whether you've made it or not, the 3rd dice you roll determines how well or badly you succeed or fail, depending on whether you failed or succeeded. It's a really, really kind of interesting way of running a role-playing game. It kind of has elements of, the sort of system that Call of Cthulhu always used, but with a little something extra. I like it. I could see using it. It actually is very thought-provoking, and there's a lot of detail on how you modify these roles based on, again, how good your character is at things, et cetera, et cetera. But I found it really pretty thought-provoking, and definitely very different from how sort of these things are determined in a more traditional role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons. Even though, again, it's an older game. The character creation process is really also very interesting. It's actually a 16-step process that goes into a huge number of things that give your character a kind of a lot of background. You'll have sort of a curse you're laboring under. Your parentage matters. The profession of your parents matters. Your chosen profession. You start with a certain number of experience points that you use to buy skills from a skill package, depending on your profession, which is really interesting. And you can also, as you go up levels, you have sort of experience points you've spent, and then experience points that you have total. And the total determine you going up levels, sort of opening up new things your character can do. Whereas along the way, you can improve by spending experience points. You can improve your skills, and you can acquire new skills by spending it while also going up levels. It's really very clever. I like it a lot. Combat, you have characteristics, and they matter. Again, influencing your skill shaping rolls. You have basically hit points. Combat, it looks pretty hard. Not hard like intellectually hard, but like rigorous and tough. But it looks like there's a lot you can do. Again, I kind of, reading it, I was kind of reminded, and this is probably just sort of a pejorative on my part because I've played so much Hero System because, I published it. It reminded me of having that sort of level of complexity, but kind of sprinting from some simple concepts. You've got, just like with Hero, you got some simple concepts, and then they kind of explode outward into a huge variety of options that you can then buy and modify and improve your character. Really, kind of it looks like a lot of fun. The tone of the game is, again, medieval. You're definitely in its stock setting. You were playing in a fairly realistic, high medieval setting with the idea of sort of chivalry and knights and bandits in the forest and exotic travelers coming from sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. There's a lot there. Again, it's a very detailed book. Lots of rooms for different kind of characters to make an encounter. The tone isn't really dark, but it isn't lighthearted. It kind of reads like an academic work. If you've ever read any kind of serious scholarly works on the Middle Ages, it kind of reads like that, but not in a bad way. It doesn't drag down. Particularly, I found the prose pretty crisp, pretty straightforward. It's not particularly groggy, like whoever has written the current edition. Let me be fair. The authors of the current edition, there's a bunch of them. I'll just compliment them generally. They know they're living in the 21st century. I mean, there's definitely a lot of discussion of race, gender, and other issues from a pretty modern perspective. Neither really glorifies the Middle Ages nor condemns them unnecessarily. The condemnation seems about right. It's pretty straightforward. Really, the tone is quite good. I see it being one of those games where you would probably create the tone of what this game's gonna be like. It could be lighthearted, it could be serious, it could be very Ivanhoe, lots of daring do and Arthurian stuff. It could be very Glenn Cookie, Black Company, dark and mercenary and gloomy. Really, it seems very much, setting the tone seems very much left up to the game master and the players. Oh, interesting fact. I believe this is the first game to use the term game master as opposed to dungeon master, a historical claim to fame. In conclusion, Chivalry and Sorcery is an interesting alternate take with very long and storied history, going back to the beginnings of role-playing gaming on medieval role-playing games. It feels very different from Dungeons and Dragons. It feels very authentic and historical. There's a lot of crunch there, but in a good way. There's just a few simple concepts the game builds off of to give it a really put a lot of meat on the bones. I remember reading it thinking, yeah, I'd play this. I'd like to try playing this very much. So I recommend it highly. Chivalry and Sorcery, available from Indie Press Revolution. Follow us on the social medias, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to our newsletter. And remember, gamers, when you're riding on a warhorse in full armor, don't fall off.